Greetings and welcome back to our study in Mark's Gospel. Today we are in Mark 14 and we're finishing out the chapter going from verse 53 to 72. In this in this passage, Jesus has been arrested. The disciples have fled, and Jesus is taken back to the uh, residence of the chief priest. Now, there is a lot of speculation around this particular passage because what happens to Jesus does seem to be somewhat irregular. Typically, such meetings where the council was going to make a decision were not done at night. They were not done at this residence necessarily. They were done through proper channels. But we should take into account that this is a special circumstance where the chief priests, the ruling elders of the community, feel that there is no time to waste. They want Jesus tried, and if there is punishment, they want that to be done before the Passover officially begins at sunset on Friday. So they're working with a very limited time frame. There is no reason to assume that this is a kangaroo court. There is no reason to assume that Jesus was not getting, by the standards of the time, a fair trial. In fact, Mark wants you to see more that Jesus is getting kind of a fair trial. Jesus is is going up against the system that is in place. It is not that uh, the chief priests, that the rulers of the um, the rulers of the Jewish temple are skirting the laws in order to convict Jesus out of a personal vendetta. They are going through the proper channels. They're doing the things that should be done. Mark wants you to see that Jesus does, in some ways, get a very fair trial, and that um, he is dutifully convicted. The question is not whether or not Jesus gets a fair trial. The question is whether or not the system that is in place is is inherently just and accurate, and that's a difference. Mark is not trying to hide. Is not trying to say that these people circumvented the law. No, Mark is trying to say that these people didn't circumvent the law. They gave Jesus, by their standards, a fair trial. And the trial, it resonates around this idea of who are you? They ask Jesus who he is. He fails to answer. And they bring in witnesses to testify against Jesus. Now, Mark does say that these witnesses do not make accurate testimony. They do not provide an accurate testimony. And we do see a little bit of that in their testimony of Jesus said he would destroy the sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days. And this does seem to be a corruption of what Jesus says in John chapter 2. So John 2 puts the cleansing of the temple, as we call it, at the very beginning of the book. It's a highlight of, or a way to highlight Jesus's first miracle, the turning of water into wine, with his last sign, that is cleansing the temple. It's a rhetorical device. But in Mark's account, we see that this happened right before, on the Monday of Holy Week, right before Jesus is arrested. This is one of the motivating features of, or the motivators of the Pharisees or the temple priests' response. This event on that Monday is part of what justifies the arrest of Jesus, or is used to justify the arrest of Jesus. And Jesus, we do think, maybe said that he was that if they destroyed the sanctuary, and I use that word intentionally, he would rebuild it in 3 days, because as John says, he was talking about the sanctuary of his body. Now, Mark uses the same word that John uses there, which is different from the word Mark has been using for temple. So that does at least lead me to think that um, he is building, or this case was built off of what Jesus actually said in the temple that day, although we see twisted, because he did not say he would destroy, but if they destroyed. If they destroyed the sanctuary, then Jesus would rebuild it. And Christians have come to take on this language that the temple is within the church, within our bodies, within us, and within Jesus. All of this is metaphorical language, but it is something that we have resonated with. And Jesus seemed to use two different words. One is sanctuary, that referred to the place of worship that he could say is in my body. And the other is for the temple, the structure. And what this charge hinges on is that where Jesus is using these words separately and for distinct ways, um, the people who are testifying before the Jewish leaders are conflating these terms, and with some degree of some degree of license there. They are allowed to conflate them because the words that Jesus used are both used of the temple structure. And so without Jesus articulating exactly what he meant by that statement, there's some truth to it. Again, the witnesses seem to take it the wrong way, and I'll say that Jesus said he was going to destroy instead of the people around him would destroy. But and so in that much it's false. But in the rest of it, there is a grain of truth that we have to reckon with, and it does seem to be that they just misunderstood what Jesus is saying. This double meaning that Jesus uses so often. They misunderstood the double meaning, and so they made an accusation against him that just didn't hold water. But it does seem like there is at least an attempt to give Jesus some say in the court, although I'd imagine in the ears of most of those who were present, Jesus was already guilty. But at the very least, they seem to be trying to give him a fair say and to listen to him, although, as Jesus will go on to prove, that leash, that rope is very short. Jesus doesn't have a lot of room here to negotiate, so he is wisely staying quiet in all of this. Jesus does say, though, he does respond when they ask him directly, are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? Are you this anointed one, the Son of the Most High? Are you this person? Are you making these claims about yourself? Jesus does respond affirmatively. Now, there is some debate here. The words that Mark uses can be a reference back to the book of Exodus, where God says to Moses, I am, when Moses asks for God's name. That can be a reference here. It can also be that Jesus is just strongly affirming what the court has asked. Are you the Messiah? Yes, I am. It's not completely clear. Maybe there is some tendency, I think in Christian circles, there's definitely a tendency to read this as Jesus making himself equal with God. I'm not completely convinced that Mark's doing that, but I think it is definitely possible and probably likely that Mark is making that some sort of claim like that. When we look at John, though, John makes that claim much stronger than Mark does. Mark doesn't seem to hint at it until right here, so it might be a strategy. It wouldn't be beyond Mark to cover something up until the right moment and then just shockingly reveal it. But there's also a reality that Jesus could just be saying, yes, I am. And then he quotes from Psalm 110, 110:1, and Daniel 7:13. Now, we already saw this Daniel 7 quote earlier, and we said that when Jesus used it in the previous chapter, that he was talking about the people would see him or recognize, not just literally see, but to recognize he had power given to him from God. So here we have Jesus again saying, I am the Messiah. I am the one that God has given authority to, and you are going to see that authority. You are going to see the fact that I am the ruler that God gives authority to in the person of the son of Adam, the son of man, however you like to translate that, the human one, the great human, however you do that. But Jesus is saying to them, I am the Messiah. I am this anointed one that you've been waiting for, and I am going to conflate that for you with Daniel 7:13, with Daniel 7, so that you understand not only, yes, I am the one you've been expecting, but here's exactly Psalm 110, Daniel 7. Here's how you should be interpreting it. And these people, above everybody else that Jesus has spoken to, would understand clearly what Jesus is saying in quoting these scriptures, especially if they understand him to be quoting from Exodus. If they understand Jesus to be saying, I am, in the sense of God to Moses, and then going on to quote from Psalm 110 and then from Daniel 7, you can understand very quickly why they would have a charge of blasphemy against him. They would not have believed this, but Jesus is making a very high claim of himself. This is, he is at the very least elevating himself above what any human in their mind should have. The claims of Daniel are not something that most Jews would have seen as belonging to an individual. They would have seen it as Israel as a whole. And Jesus claiming that he has the authority of all of Israel and doing so on God's behalf, this would have been a very serious claim. So again, we understand exactly why the chief priests, this ruling body, would say you are guilty of blasphemy. According to their system, according to their structure, this would have fit well within that category of blasphemy. This also shows us the grounds on which Jesus will actually be executed. Jesus is not executed for blasphemy. Jesus is not executed by this court. This court has functioned in a way that they are supposed to. They are working to keep the peace in Jerusalem, but they are also working with the Romans. And we will see that in the next chapter, next week, when Jesus is handed over to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The charge is not blasphemy. The charge is insurrection. The charge is being a revolutionary. Jesus has set himself up as a king, as an anointed king, who is going to lead in their minds, in the Jewish minds. This anointed king is going to lead an armed revolution against Rome. That's kind of what the common understanding of the Jewish Messiah would be. Whether he would personally lead it, or people who are committed to his reign and rule would lead the revolution, and then the Messiah would appear after that, it was debatable. But there were certainly people who thought that if when the Messiah shows up, he's going to create this army around him, and then he's going to lead that army into victory over the Romans. So what has to be going through the minds of these temple authorities is that Jesus rode in on Sunday. They would have seen that action, or at least had witnesses who have told them. He's ridden in like a king, in the words of the prophet Zechariah. He has then gone in on Monday and confronted the temple structure. On Tuesday, he confronted the temple structure. It is now Thursday. What they have to be thinking is that during this Passover ceremony, commemorating God's great saving act where God led the people of Israel out of Egypt, they have to be thinking that Jesus, at some point during this 8-day festival, Jesus is going to stand up, call attention to himself, declare himself king, and call for military action against Rome. That is what they are thinking. That's why they are doing this in such a rush. They want Jesus out, away from the crowds, so that there is no revolution, there is no insurrection, because if there is, they know what will happen. Rome will come down, and they will come down swift and hard, just like they did in 70 AD that destroyed the temple. So the chief priests are trying to prevent that by calling what they think is a revolutionary movement by taking out Jesus. So this is not a kangaroo court. This is not a court that is just concerned with taking out Jesus because he is politically or he has some popularity. This is not simply Jesus is popular, so we can't have that. He's more popular than us. He's going to lead people away from us. No, they seem to seriously suspect that Jesus is going to raise a revolution. But we should also notice that Jesus uses the exact same language from Daniel 7 that he used in the last chapter. You will see, and here he addresses them, you. We said in the last chapter that the fact that he said they instead of you is a very important term. Here, you. This is what we would have expected Jesus to say to his disciples if he was predicting his return. Instead, he says to the chief priests, you will see the Son of Man raised to power. This does not, again, mean that they are going to see Jesus return. Jesus is not anticipating that Caiaphas or Annas, who are middle-aged men, are going to live to see the destruction of the temple that he foretold. That's not what he's saying. He is saying, you're going to try to carry out your plans, but you're going to see in that your plans overridden by God's plans. And you're going to see that I now have power and I come in the kingdom. Again, figurative language, not a literal, not literally meaning that you are going to see his return, but rather that you are going to witness to Jesus taking authority. If it had been about Jesus showing off to them and showing up physically, I'm sure he would have made an appearance to them during the resurrection, or after the resurrection, before the ascension. I think that whole 40 days would have looked completely different if that's what he was talking about. Instead, he is talking about receiving power, going into God's throne room and receiving power, because that is what Daniel was talking about in Daniel 7. So that's what's happening with Jesus. But at the same time that Jesus is in the temple, or in the house of the chief priest, Peter has snuck in to the courtyard. Now, in John's gospel, we see that that the disciple that Jesus loved sneaks Peter into, or gets Peter into the courtyard, because he's known there. Now, Peter here seems to have gotten himself in, at least according to this. That doesn't mean that the story in John is inaccurate. It just means that the focus here is on Peter, specifically on Peter over against all of the other disciples, because Peter is actually trying to live out what he said to Jesus earlier in the night. Peter has said, I'm going to stick by you. Even when everybody else deserts, I'm going to stick by you. And here he is looking at Jesus and saying, see, I told you, I'm going to stick by you. But where Jesus is in court with the most powerful individuals in his land, the hierarchy that has the most authority, Peter is outside in the courtyard, confronted by a slave girl, the person who would have the least authority in the entirety of the land. A slave girl would have had no power, nothing whatsoever, and Peter can't stand up to her. She calls him out. He refuses. Then the rooster crows. A little later, she's standing by the fire with some other people, kind of points to him and says, hey, that guy's one of his disciples. And Peter says no. And then finally, on the third confrontation, Peter swears an oath that he doesn't know Jesus. Now, this we see in the way Peter responds is an elevation of his temper. He starts off with a kind of a polite, no, you're mistaken. I understand the mistake, but no. And then at the very end, he's swearing an oath that he does not know Jesus. He has up the ante each time. And then when the rooster crows, he recognizes his fault. He recognizes what he's done wrong and how he has, just as Jesus said, deserted Jesus in his time of need. Peter could have very easily lived up to his bravado and his boast earlier in the evening and admitted, yeah, I'm one of his followers. But he chose not to. In his mind, he's probably thinking, well, I need to get the lay of the land. I can't blow my cover too early. These people don't know who I am. But if they do, I might not be able to sneak Jesus out, or whatever he's thinking, or get into where Jesus is and help Jesus. Like, whatever Peter's plan is, and we're not told, it seems pretty clear that he's trying to avoid making himself known, not because he's scared, but because he has an idea of what he wants to do, or at least he's trying to get to where Jesus is and doesn't want his cover blown. But in the end, he recognizes that backfires, and that he has indeed fallen into the trap that Jesus warned him about. And he is denying Jesus the same way. And unlike Jesus, who is going up against the most powerful people and standing strong against the most powerful people, Peter is unable to stand up to the least powerful individuals in this community. And we see that dynamic of, again, Jesus has been praying, not just in the garden that night, but throughout his life, preparing himself for this ordeal, for this time. Peter, though, has routinely not understood and has, we saw that night, failed to pray, failed to sustain himself and put himself into the right mental and spiritual position to take on the challenges. And so he has fallen down. Now, the same is true of us so often, where we fail, like Peter, to prepare ourselves for the situation, and so we fall. This is going to reverberate later when we get to chapter 16, where Peter is forgiven and given grace to come back in, and it becomes a blessing to us. But right now we want to sit with Peter in this idea of, I have failed to live out what Jesus has told me. I was warned, I had the opportunities, and I failed. And we look at that contrast between Jesus, who has succeeded, and Peter, who has failed. And we go back to their night of prayer, or lack of it. And we say, well, how does that impact my life? And how do I then prepare myself for the road ahead? Anyway, that's what I see in this. If you have other questions or comments that you want to talk about, please let me know. I would love to have a deeper conversation with you. Until we meet again, God bless.